Hello there, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the WayForward chat. I am Hoff, your WayForward social media Tinkerbat, coming to you live from Razak 2, wishing you a happy Capybara Appreciation Day, as well as some well-earned rest, particularly if you spent it marching all over the LA Convention Center for Anime Expo last weekend. Many thanks to everyone who turned out for our panel. But today we are not here to talk about Anime Expo or capybaras. Oh no! Last year, Atari released Yars Rising, which was developed by WayForward, but that game would not have been possible. It would not have existed if not for the Atari 2600 classic Yars Revenge. And today, I am joined not only by my usual co-host, WayForward head of BizDev and Publishing, Adam Tierney,
Hello.
but also the legendary designer and programmer of Yars Revenge, as well as other 2600 games like E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark, Howard Scott Warshaw. Thank you so much for joining us on the WayForward chat.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure being had.
Yeah, this is awesome. So I will let you two, Adam and Howard, take it from here. I do want to mention it'll be a bit of a tight fit today, so we might not be able to do a Q&A. We might have to skip that part, but we will be back to answer your questions next week. Anyway, Adam, Howard, please take it away.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. I grew up on Atari 2600. For whatever reason, I played on 2600 for much longer than most of my friends. While everybody else was on NES, I was really just, still doing a deep dive on 2600 games. And the games that you worked on are some of my absolute favorites. So it's an absolute honor. Hopefully I can make it through this interview without too much stuttering or stammering, but I feel like I'm in the presence of greatness. So thank you so much for making time to hang out with us for a little bit.
Oh, you are too kind. Thank you, Adam. I'm really glad to be here, genuinely.
So the first question we always ask our guests is, what's your video game origin story? And yours is kind of interesting because you were, a professional very early in the industry. But what got you into games in general, and then also what got you over to Atari?
It's an interesting story, and interesting enough that I felt compelled to write a whole book about it. My book, Once Upon Atari: How I Made History by Killing an Industry, was covers a lot of this. But I'll tell you that when I went, my my origin story for gaming is kind of the origin story of the industry, right? Because I didn't grow up in a world with gaming, with video gaming. I grew up in a world without video gaming and contributed to creating a world that's full of video gaming. Getting to Atari was a rather circuitous route to me because it was more about what I didn't do than what I did do. Originally, I avoided computers like the plague. I never touched a computer until my sophomore year in college. I was in economics at the time, and they said you're going nowhere without computers in this field. So I picked up a computer course because I had to, but it was a revelation. It was a revelation to me because this was the most amazing thing I'd ever done and wanted to do more and more and more of it. So I not only switched out of economics, I went on to get a master's in computer engineering relatively quickly and jumped out into the world of professional computing, which was a miserable world for me. I went to Hewlett Packard and I was bored out of my mind, and all the passion and excitement I had found in computing was gone. But the kind of computing that I was doing in college, which was microprocessor-based real-time control programming, which almost no one was doing back then, it basically had two applications, and none of those were at HP. So at HP, I was back to working on mainframes, which is not very interesting to me. But in real microprocessor-based control systems, there's only two things pretty much you did with that in the late 70s and early 80s. And that was Defense Department applications or video game programming, which I was unaware of. So I just missed the good times of really knocking your head against a wall trying to make code fit in limited spaces and meet timing, really ridiculous timing requirements. I like that challenge. So I'm at HP one day, and my usual boredom stuff, and I tended to act out and do some wacky stuff. And one of my colleagues comes up to me and says, "I was telling my wife a Howard story the other day, And she said, you know, where I work, stuff like that goes on all the time. And I said, well, where's that? And he said, Atari. She worked at Atari. And I thought, wow, I knew Atari made games, and I wasn't particularly into video games at that point. I was aware of them. But I thought, wow, it sounds like a really interesting place to work. And it sounds like they do the kinds of programming I'd like to do. And the fact that they make games is nice, right? But that was like the third thing about going to work at Atari. And I love games. I've always enjoyed games. I've always played games. From the time I was 5 years old, I would always try to make new rules for games and try to improve the games that I would play. I just never particularly got into video games initially. My friends did, and I would watch them play. For some reason, it wasn't compelling to me initially. It became more compelling. So I called up Atari, and I pushed and pushed until I got some interviews. I went through a whole interview series. It looked really good. I thought we were totally on track, and they rejected me. It didn't hire me. But as I had interviewed there and connected with some of the people there and saw what was going on there, I knew this was a place I absolutely had to be. And so I pushed and begged and pleaded until I got an opportunity. And so I negotiated my way into a 20% cut in pay and a probationary period. And I was so glad to accept that. And that's my origin story for video games.
That's such a fascinating perspective because, usually when we talk to guests, especially ones that have worked at WayForward, we interview a lot of our staffers. They're raised on your games. They're raised on the games that were, influenced by your games. So it's fascinating to talk with somebody who was kind of right there, right at the beginning of home console gaming. On Atari 2600, there were 3 games that you worked on that were released. I think you had done some development beyond that. And I'd love to talk a little bit about each one of those today. The first being, as we mentioned before, Yars Revenge. Such a incredible, unique game. There's so much uniqueness to the game. Like it has lots of very tactile feels. Like I love the jackhammer and tink 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 kind of sound effect of the nibbling. It's so satisfying for the player. It also has like incredibly deep lore and story and characters, and there was the accompanying comic. What were the origins of that game? Was there any sort of kind of directive that you received from Atari about what type of game to make, or is it just kind of, everything that you felt like doing at the time?
Absolutely. I mean, it's all about the wrong turns and me trying to go where I'm not supposed to. And because that's kind of the story of my life. And so, as I said, I got to Atari on probation. So you figure you just got to be a good boy and do what they tell you and try to make it okay. When I got to Atari and I saw what was going on there, I knew this was a place I belonged. I knew it was a place I had to be. And so when I looked at the idea of doing a first game, I didn't just think of trying to do a game. I thought of creating a calling card. I wanted to make a splash. I wanted to innovate. I wanted to prove to everybody that not only I should be at Atari, but I want to be the example of an Atari person. And so I wanted to put out a groundbreaking game. So that's the mindset I came in with. And my first assignment, which I got after a couple of days, I read the manual for a few days, kind of got the idea of the 2600. And then I got my first assignment, which was a coin-op conversion of the game Star Castle. That's what Yars Revenge started out as. Coin-op conversion of a game. And I played that game for a while, and I looked it over, and I looked at the hardware, and I really thought of it, and I was still very early and only really getting the hang of it. But it was very clear to me right away that that game was going to suck on the 2600, especially limited to 4K memory. So I went to the guy who hired me and said, that first assignment you gave me, I don't want to do it. I think that would really suck, and I just can't have my first game suck. But I didn't just say, no, I won't do that game. What I did was I had worked up a design for an alternate gameplay that I felt was better adapted to the hardware. And so I explained it to him, and I had some graph paper, things laid out, and I just made a whole presentation. I said, I think this would be a much better game, and this is what I'd rather do. And to his credit, he said, okay, go for it. So right off the bat, was already redirecting and rechanneling, where I thought things should go because I needed it to be spectacular. And that first assignment I didn't feel would enable me to get to a spectacular place. And so that's the beginning of Yars. That's the beginning of Time Freeze, which was the original working title of this game, because it didn't become Yars Revenge until the very end of the game. But the game itself, the development, started off, and my working title was Time Freeze. And what that was uh, it was a concept for a huge payoff. Because one thing I wanted to do was I didn't know what you do in the game completely. I didn't know exactly how the game would go. But whatever it is you do in the game that's like a great thing to do, I wanted it to have a spectacular payoff. And Time Freeze was my code for the victory sequence that would play out, because I had, from the very beginning, planned a very elaborate victory sequence. I just felt that was important because I wanted a game that really was exciting to look at, exciting to watch, total sensory overload. And so that's where I'm coming from with it. So I started to put things on the screen and throw it together, and people started to notice it, right? Because most people, when they start developing a game on the 2600, they put up a dot or a square, sort of just representations for the graphics. And
Yeah,
I
most
thought,
of
this is
the
a
most
thing
of the games are very literal. It's just like, here's the box, here's the man, here's the platform.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, even less so in development. In development, you start off with just a dot or a square just to test out the gameplay. And that's what you're looking at for months until you start getting graphics later in the game when you start wanting to finalize it. And I didn't like that idea. I figure if I'm going to be staring at this screen all this time, I wanted to do something. So when on my first player display, I put up an actual animated graphic, which was the yard, which turned out to be the yard. That was my original concept. And I just wanted something that would look cool flying around the screen and moved. And people saw that and they thought, well, that's kind of cool. What does it do? And it's like, well, I don't know yet, but it's cool, isn't it? And I would create things like this, and I would put things on the screen, and people would go, "Oh, that's cool. What does it do?" And I'd say, "Well, not really sure yet, but it's cool, isn't it?" And then I hit on the ion zone, right? Because the big challenge on developing on the 2600 is space and memory size, right? You have very, very little memory. You only have 4K for all of your program code and literally only 128 bytes of RAM. So all the variable information, every position, all the score data, everything you want to save that can vary in the game has to fit in 128 bytes. That's not really a lot of space. And so trying to find ways to save space. And so, before I went into technology, I was in economics and mathematics, and I also had a minor in theater. And so I have degrees in mathematics and computer engineering, and people go, well, that's what you use, to do your job at Atari. But actually, it's my degrees in economics and theater that I think were much more valuable in terms of working at Atari. Because economics taught me how to conserve and get the most out of resources, limited resources, and the theater background, because this is entertainment. And, you can, some people look at a video game as a computer program, as a thing you need to just program and put together, and it's a technical production. And it is that, but there's a lot of things that are technical productions that aren't entertainment products. To me, a video game is more about the entertainment. It's not about what's going on in the screen. It's about what's going on in the mind of the player. And so I would look to do things visually on a screen and in audio as well that would cue emotions in the player. That's the way I thought of making a video game. So to me, the technical challenge was later. First, I would think, what do I want to do to the player's head that's going to create a fun experience? And that's why I made a very elaborate soundscape. The thing I'm most excited about with Yars Revenge is that Yars Revenge set the most firsts of almost any game It established a lot of standards. I mean, Yars Revenge was the first full screen explosion. It was the first 2600 game with a pause mode for the players. It was the first 2600 game to not have a frame, to have just open black to the edge, which I think makes the game expand at night in the dark, which is when I'd like to play. Right, and it makes it feel bigger. And the score is just on a whole nother screen. That way it's not interfering with your concept of just being in the game world. It's the first game with a backstory. I actually invented the backstory in video games with Yars Revenge. And there's a number of other firsts that Yars established, and this was exciting to me. And the Ion Zone was an example of the kind of thinking you really need to do on the 2600. Because when I put that up, people would go, wow, that's really cool. How'd you do that? And wow, how much graphics did that cost you? How much memory did you spend on that for the graphics? And I would tell them, 0. It actually cost me 0 memory. And they're like, what? And so I would explain it. And I'd say, because what I did was I did what I thought was it was an expediency more than it was like an inspiration, right? It was like, I need something to I wanted a glitter effect. I wanted a cool glitter effect. And I thought, so what I need is I need randomized data. I need randomized data for the graphic, and I need randomized data for the color. And what I realized was, if you look at the 2600 instruction set, which is what we were always looking at, that's kind of like randomized data. And so I thought, I'll just use the code as the graphics. That way it will cost me 0 extra memory. I don't have to create a random number generator. I don't have to store any of that stuff or use any RAM in the allocation. I just grab a byte of code, throw it in the graphics register, throw it in the color register, and do that every line. And the result is what you saw on the screen. And it was like really a pretty cool visual effect. And again,
Yeah,
I was able. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say that the Ion Zone is not just kind of the defining visual of that game, but I would argue of the whole 2600 system. I mean, it's so iconic, it's so memorable, and it's so different from anything else on the system. I wanted to ask, related to that, aside from the visuals, I love the fact that in this game and kind of all of your games, there's more choice than a lot of games at the time. So the Ion Zone is a perfect example. You can play the game very safe and really kind of, hug your way in there and just poke out when you need to, or you can play more aggressively and swirl around the missiles. Was that something that you kind of did intentionally? I feel like there's so much more choice in the moment-to-moment gameplay of your games on 2600 as opposed to a lot of them at the time where it was just do A to perform B, and it was just kind of like there's only one path.
That's a really good point. And I hate that when there's only one path. I really hate that because it doesn't make any sense. One of the things I really respect or don't respect in a video game is, does the world make sense in every way you engage it? Or is it what I call a lock and key thing, where although you have 17 guns in the game, there's only one gun that will open this particular problem or solve this particular issue? That doesn't make sense to me. You want the game to work for a variety of play styles. I'm not saying that's easy to do, but there was intention there. I'll give you another example. It's like, first of all, as I was doing the game, when I got to first playable with Yars, it didn't work. It sucked because I had a really horrible controller scheme. And after I took some consultation, decided to really change the controller scheme, but there was a big problem. The reason I had the controller scheme the way it was, so you could activate the Zorlon cannon. I had to pull back on the stick for activating the Zorlon cannon. And when I went to direct control, I had a right-left rotate and a forward thrust kind of control system, which was the wrong kind of control system for this game. And so I switched it to a direct control, just you move and go, and that feels good. But now how do you get the Zorlon cannon? And so I was forced into putting that mechanic into gameplay. And that made a huge difference in the game, because now what it did was, okay, that's where I came up with the idea of eating the energy shield. You eat the energy shield to activate the Zorlon cannon. And the great thing about that, like you say, you're going to make a choice. You're going to try and play the game safely, or are you going to play aggressively? You have to put yourself in danger to activate the weapon you need to kill the Kotile. Right? And what happens when you run out of shield? When you run out of shield, now you can activate it by touching the Kotile, but you have to touch it while it's not in swirl. Otherwise, you're dead. So
It's
again,
so terrifying.
it is, but you have to, your risk and reward are aligned, right? To get the reward, you have to take some risk. And Yars puts you in the position of having to make that trade-off. And it's a great trade-off, in your mind. And I like the idea that your safety and your potential are always trading off. Another thing that's very key to the design of Yars Revenge is movie making, because I didn't grow up thinking I want to be a game maker. I grew up thinking I want to be a movie director. So I knew a lot about movies. I watched a lot of movies. I loved movies. And one thing I really understood about movies is movies, especially action movies, direct your eye in different places and then pay it off. Like if you look at a lot of action sequences in movies, if they're well directed, and Spielberg does this a lot, and so does Lucas, you'll see there's right, left, up, down, right, left, up, down, right? Is that, it drags your eye in one scene toward one point, and the next scene will begin at that point and move in another direction. So you don't have to jump with your eye. You're already at the right place on the screen for the next entry, but it keeps you moving around the screen, right? And it brings the whole screen into play. One of the things I really didn't like about Star Castle was Star Castle is just geocentric. There's all the action's in the center of the screen and not much else happens. And it's all about that, and it's not very dynamic. So what I wanted to do was I created, I have the drone chasing the Yar, and you have to aim the Zorlon cannon with your vertical position, right? So what that means is you're always going to be in motion, and when you're going to take a shot, you have to be in vertical motion. Right? You're going to have a vertical axis to your motion, either up or down. You're going to be moving and the drone's going to be chasing you. And at the same time, you're going to have the Kotile, which occasionally is going to shoot out from the right. And your Zorlon cannon, you're always firing that from the left across the screen. And there's your right, left, up, down, right, left, up, down. And it keeps your eye engaged and moving all over the screen. And it keeps the action flowing all over the screen. And these were very much acts of intention. These were things I very much wanted to do because I want you to have a sensory experience, ultimately an overload, but really I wanted playing this game to just be an involved sensory experience. And I hope I achieved that with this game.
Oh, I think you absolutely did. Like I said, it's so memorable. It stands out amongst everything else at the time. Gosh, we don't have that much time, so I want to move into the next one.
Well, is it interesting to hear the thinking behind these things?
Absolutely, and I've read so many interviews with you and seen so many interviews, and I'm still learning new stuff now that I'd never heard before. So thank you so much for diving into this stuff. One of my absolute...
You're asking good questions. What can I
thank
say?
you. Well, I was raised on the right system. One of my favorite Atari games ever, and I think probably arguably the most impressive Atari 2600 game I can think of is Raiders of the Lost Ark. It is
awesome.
so deep and so nuanced. And compared to a lot of games at the time where it's really just kind of, there's a lot of good games on 2600, but most of them are just single system or single screen. This is a massive adventure. There is so much secrets and nuance and varied gameplay. Like every screen, you're doing something new from a different perspective. I'd love to hear how that one started, and did Spielberg or LucasArts, did they have any kind of parameters when you started the game, or was just kind of this is, again, exactly what you wanted to do going in?
Well, Yars was quite a drama all the way through. And when I finished doing Yars, it was still going to be months before it was released because Yars became the most tested game in video game history. That's a whole nother story, which is covered elaborately in my book, Once Upon Atari. But for Raiders, I started working on Raiders before Yars was even released because the drama was going on with Yars, but I was done working on it. So I started working on Raiders. But you don't just start working on Raiders. Lucas wasn't really very involved in Raiders at all. Spielberg was involved very peripherally, but he was involved in one major way, and that was that he was going to choose the programmer. If you were a candidate to work on Raiders, you had to interview with Spielberg, and he had to approve you work on the game. So, one of the most amazing days of my life, and I have had a number of amazing days in my life, but one of the all-time biggies was the day I went to interview with Spielberg to do Raiders, because it started off at like 5:30 in the morning with me getting up, and I don't like getting up early in the morning, but this was worth it. So I got up like at 5:30 and I grabbed a Yars Revenge cart because I was scheduled for a 9:30 a.m. meeting in Los Angeles. I'm in San Jose, which is like 400 miles away. So I get up, I grab a Yars, I go to the airport, I fly to LA, I get in a cab, I go through all this stuff, through all the LA rush hour traffic, and I make it to Warner Studios. And there's like 5 minutes to go. I actually make it there at like 9:25. I walk in, there's the receptionist, and I'm just about to go, hello, and she looks up at me and she says, hello, Mr. Warshaw. Your meeting has been rescheduled till 3:30 this afternoon.
Oh no.
Like, what? What? Are you telling me I have to sit here for 6 hours waiting? I flew to get here. I can't believe this is the case. And she goes, yes, but I can tell you that Mr. Spielberg is very excited to meet you. So I said, okay. So I'm not that big a complainer. I'm a make lemonade kind of guy in a situation like this. And so I thought about it for a second. So the first thing I thought was going to have to change the flight. So I looked at her, I said, can you change my flight to get a later flight? She goes, oh, absolutely. And she just took the ticket, and that was cool. I thought, this is good. And so then I thought, I'm at a TV movie studio and with 6 hours to kill. So I just said to her, is it okay if I just start roaming around the studio and I'll just be back at 3:30? She goes, oh, absolutely. Go ahead. So I got to spend a full day at Warner Brothers Studios, unescorted, walking all over the lots and everywhere. And I went on sets. I did all kinds of stuff. I stole things from sets, from things that I did. It was the most amazing day. And at the end of that day, here I come back, and there's Steven Spielberg. And now I'm going to hang out with Steven Spielberg for a while, except it's not just hanging out. I have to interview. I have to, see if I can get approved for doing the game. So I showed him Yars, and he really liked Yars, and he thought that was cool. And we chatted, and we had a nice talk. But I think the thing that really clinched it for me was, I said to him, Stephen, I had seen Close Encounters. I love Close Encounters. And this is still pre-E.T., right? He's probably making E.T. at this point, but nobody really knows about E.T. yet. So I said to him, I have a theory about you. I have a theory that you are actually an alien yourself. Would you like to hear it? He goes, yeah. And I went through it. I explained, I have this whole theory that the aliens will provide an advanced team to culturalize the planet, when we're going to meet them. And I said, he's probably part of this team. He's like the production arm. And I said, and your marketing team is doing an amazing job getting it seen all over the world. So I just want to say, good job. Gave him a big thumbs up. And he kind of smiled. I think he thought that was cute and stuff. And so that was it. We finished up the interview, and then I went back home. And the next morning when I came into work, they said, well, Spielberg called and said, you're doing Raiders. That's how I came to do Raiders.
Oh, that's
calling
amazing.
Spielberg an alien.
And
but to do Raiders.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm going to do Raiders. And like I said, like with Yars Revenge, my goal was to make a really breakthrough game to really establish myself as a video game maker, a credible video game maker in the world of Atari. Raiders of the Lost, Raiders was such a different thing because this was going to be an adventure type game. And Adventure, the original Adventure by Warren Robinette, was an amazing game. That is a genre-defining game. It's like a killer app. And I thought, if I'm going to do something, my biggest fear in the world is to do a knockoff. It's just to do a knockoff of something that's already there. I want to do something original and creative with anything I do, and I want it to be groundbreaking. And so with Raiders, I decided if I'm going to do an adventure style game, it's going to be the biggest adventure anybody could imagine on the 2600. And I wanted to have different screens and different gameplays, different places you could go, and a real involved, elaborate experience. And Raiders is a great game to do, movie rather, to do a game from, because it has a great action through line. So I just thought about it and started designing it. And it took me 7 months to do Yars, and it took me about 10 months to do Raiders. And by the end, at the end of the game, I got the game all set up, and I was going to present the game to Spielberg at the CES in Chicago. That was coming up in June. And so we did. I had the game mostly done. So I went to a studio and made a videotape of a playthrough of Raiders. So we went to this studio and they hooked up a 2600 to a recorder and they put a mic on me. And for the only time in my entire life, I sat down and played through the game flawlessly. I mean, in all the development time, I have played this game many, many, many times. I have never played it through this clean. I don't know. It was a one-shot wonder. It was amazing. But I just played it and narrated the whole game totally cleanly. It was one take, bam, done. Then when I had that tape, I basically handcuffed it to me and I never let it out of my sight because there was no way anybody was going to show this tape to Spielberg without me there.
Right.
And so it came to pass that we got to show it to Spielberg in the Atari booth at CES. We went all the way upstairs in the booth, and they had the tape player, and there's Spielberg, and I popped the tape in. If anybody's wondering how long it takes to play all the way through Raiders, it took 12 minutes and 27 seconds. That's if you really know everything you need to do step by step and to run all the way through the game, it takes 12 minutes and 27 seconds. That's the only time I ever did it in that time. Played it all the way through. Now this is Steven Spielberg. Remember, I want to be a film director. This is my dream job. I mean, being an Atari game engineer, that turned out to be a pretty good dream job. I mean, that was a great job for me, and I loved that job. But historically, I had really wanted to be a film director, and I loved Spielberg, and I was very into all of his movies. And to meet him was like this weird experience, right? Because on one level, you're meeting your idol, which is always kind of funky and a weird thing to do, but it's kind of exciting. On the other level, I'm meeting this person whose work I have to do derivative work for. And that's a lot of pressure when it's Steven Spielberg and Raiders of the Lost Ark. And I'm thinking, how's this going to go? But I played the tape for him. He looked at it. And at the end of the whole thing, he looks up at me. He goes, Howard, it's great. He goes, it's just like a movie. And I thought, oh my God, Steven Spielberg feels the game that I made for his movie feels like a movie. It was, my inner world just exploded with joy. It was an amazing, amazing moment. So,
That's awesome.
Some good stuff happened at Atari.
One of my favorite things of the game, especially, and it's kind of on the same topic of what we talked about with Yars, with the idea of giving the player choices on the playstyle, is there's so many secrets in the game. And I remember as a young kid with my 2600 just having my mind blown when you're discovering things like the hidden black market or exploding through the wall, or sorry, spoilers, I should say spoilers, 40-year-old spoilers, or hooking left with the parachute. There's so many things that you really can only find and find these new locations and new gameplay goals through experimentation. Why are secrets so clearly important to you and in that game? Why? Because that was not commonplace at the time. I mean, now, you jump forward a few generations and Super Nintendo, and Zeldas, and you see a lot of that, but you didn't really see it back then. So what was your thinking on putting so much, secrets into the game?
Well, this touches on a couple of very interesting notes, I think. Okay, so when you look at it, no one's ever said to me, boy, you really like the idea of secrets, don't you, in your games? And I realize you're right. You're absolutely right. I've never really thought about it that way. I mean, in an adventure game, it's all about secrets, right? You know, an adventure game is about discovering things and uncovering things and finding stuff that you weren't aware of, and then trying to leverage that and use it later in the game. And in fact, one of the challenges of making an adventure style game, making an adventure game, if you think about it from a developer's point of view, making an adventure game is a very different experience from making an action game. Because in my opinion, when when you're making an action game, if you're making a good action game, you should be able to have exactly the same play experience as anyone else who plays the game, right? You set up the action parameters, the skill levels have to be acquired and developed, but you go ahead and you play and you practice and you do it. And you can have a legitimate player's experience making an action game. With an adventure game, any kind of game that's a puzzle game or a secrets game, the maker can never really have the experience of a player, right? Because if you're the one who designs the secrets, how are you going to know what it's like to try and encounter that and figure out the secret without having known it? You
Right.
can't. You lose your intellectual virginity. And so you can't possibly do it. So that's one thing about adventure games. They're much harder to tune for the designer because you can't really get the player experience. Um, Another thing about it is secrets. Another one of the firsts of Yars Revenge, just to briefly call back to it, was Adventure. The game Adventure was the first game that had an Easter egg. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Easter eggs in games. And uh, but Yars Revenge had the first marketing approved Easter egg. Because, and you think, why would you have to fight with marketing? Everybody knows Easter eggs are like a great thing to add to a game, and it adds to the metagaming and increases the play value. But you got to go back to why was there that signature? Why was there that Easter egg in Adventure? And Easter eggs were not launched because of fun or play or, excitement or anything like that. The origin of Easter eggs is distrust and and acrimony, right? Because Atari didn't want to let anyone know who the game makers were. And Warren Robinette was faced with the same quandary we all were. What if you go and leave Atari and you go somewhere else and they say, "Well, what have you done? Have you done anything? Anything of note?" You go, "Yes, well, I did Adventure." "Oh yeah? Well, that's baloney. We don't believe you." "No, really, I did Adventure." "Yeah, sure, anybody could say they did it." So the idea was you needed to put something in the game so that you could prove your authorship, because Atari was never going to represent your authorship anywhere and they weren't going to allow you the opportunity to claim it. So that's where Easter eggs came from originally. And I had one of those secret signatures in Yars. And then I went to marketing and just said, hey, because I had an economics degree. I was much more business focused than a lot of the engineers were. And I would go to marketing and talk with them about stuff instead of just complaining about marketing. And I'd come back to engineering and complain about marketing. So, but I said, you're missing value. Having this extra thing going on in the game, it adds value to the game. It's a great thing. And I talked them into it. And so in Yars Revenge, the Easter egg was actually in the manual. It became a part of the lore of the game and it became more explicit. But Raiders is a game, it's all about secrets. Now there are secret signatures in addition to the game secrets, but then there was the issue of, okay, it is though, how are you going to figure all this stuff out? I mean, in retrospect, when you think back on if you know how to do the game, each of the things makes sense if you get it in the context of the game, but these are elementary graphics. It's not super identifiable what's going on. So how do you put players in the position of not being able to get into the game? I did some things in Raiders that were very counterintuitive because I wanted to send the signal that you think you know what you're doing in this game, but you don't know what you're doing yet. You need to figure it out. And that started right with the controllers. Trying to find gameplay in an adventure thing, I created new kinds of gameplay. Like one of the types of gameplay you find in Raiders that you find in almost no other video game period is until much later PC games is inventory management, right? I made inventory management a part of the gameplay. And so I used two controllers for one player, which no one had ever seen before. So most people are going to plug in the cart, they're going to take their primary controller, they're going to start playing the game and hope to, get on with the game. I had to make sure they knew they needed two controllers. So what I did was I made the first controller the inventory controller that you couldn't move with, so you'd know something was wrong. And they got a lot of complaints about that, but I still think it was the right idea. And the second controller was the one that was your motion controller, which is the one you're usually going to think you need. But when they realized, when people would start to engage with this, it's like, this can't be okay. We've got to do more to help the players get in the game. And so then there was this big debate that we had with them. I didn't want to put secrets in the manual. And this is, you got to remember, this is pre-internet, right? So no one could go on and see a playthrough or get on a news group and talk with other people and get suggestions and hints and stuff like that. None of that was available. And marketing just put their foot down. They said, we have to put the secrets in the manual or nobody's going to be able to get into or get through the game, and then we're just stuck. And that's no good. And begrudgingly, I had to agree with them. I wanted to make it like the big secret thing, but because I do like the idea of secrets, and people have to really uncover them. But, there are limits. And I'm not very good with limits, but fortunately marketing was better with them. So marketing won that battle, and I revealed all the secrets except for a couple of the secret signatures in the game. And I think it was the right choice, because people couldn't get into the game without the manual. Now, I've heard of people who never had a manual who still played through the game, and all I can say to them is, hats off. That's awesome that you were able to accomplish that.
That was definitely me as a young kid. Yeah, I do not remember. I'm sure I had a manual. I did not look at it at all. I just discovered everything from, exploring. And that's why I will still, like my co-directors at WayForward can attest, I will bring your game up in conversations, design conversations, Raiders, to this day, because it is just so creative and so nuanced, and there nothing beats those endorphins of like, whoa, what is this area? I've never seen this, or whoa, I didn't know that could happen. And I love also, I mean, you were talking earlier about kind of the limited resources on Yars, but at the end of the day, Yars was still largely a single screen type system type game. You went for broke on Raiders. You had top down and side view, and like every single screen played completely different. Did you, that must have been a struggle to get so much varied gameplay again in such a limited cart, right?
It was, exactly. It was. But that was my quest. This was what I needed to do. I came from a place not of want, but of deep need as a developer. Like with Yars Revenge, my need was to establish myself and do some to show that I can show you things that you've never seen before, and that I can come up with cool stuff. I needed to prove that. I needed to establish myself. With Raiders, I needed to blow the roof off. Right? I wanted to show that you could take something relatively simple and spin it and turn it out in so many different ways, and to see all that. I have to tell you honestly that to hear you talk about Raiders the way you're talking about it, it warms my heart. I mean, it feels so good, because what I'm hearing is in some ways exactly the intention of what I was trying to get achieved. It sounds like that really landed with you, Adam, and it just means a lot to me to hear that really came through. And
Oh yeah.
because it was important to really to do something that it had to be the biggest game you could imagine, not just many postage stamps of the same screen over and over again, but really different environments, different play, maps that you have to control and work out and just make it huge. That was what I was going for. That was my need. My need with Raiders was twofold. One was to do something that was worthy of a next step beyond adventure. The other one was to prove I wasn't just a one-hit wonder, because after Yars became really successful, I thought, well, I better have a second act, right? Because, it's one thing to wonder, can I succeed or not? Once you succeed, now there's the new anxiety of, oh God, can I do it again? And by the end of Raiders, I think I really became a confident, solid game developer on the 2600, believing I could do pretty much whatever I wanted to do on the 2600, which came in really handy.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, again, I know you're best known for either Yars or ET for obviously very different reasons, but for me, Raiders is my favorite work for you just because it is such a fascinating, just super nuanced, super deep, super robust game, and it's so unlike anything else on the 2600, anything else being done at that time. So thank you so much for making all your games, but especially for making that one. It's one of my favorite games of all time.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, it's in my Once Upon Atari book, I talk about Raiders as the forgotten game because it's true. The vast majority of the interest that I get in my games is between Yars and ET. But Raiders, I think, is a very substantial piece of work as well. And it's just really nice to hear it acknowledged this way.
Yeah, I don't know if it's on any of like the, Atari retro systems, but if anybody out there can get your hands on Raiders of the Lost Ark for Atari 2600 or even just watch a playthrough on YouTube, highly, highly recommend it. It definitely influenced me as a future game designer and director in the best possible way. So we only have about 10 minutes. Let's talk about your last, the third game published at Atari on 2600, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which I am also a big fan of that game. I think it is very unfairly judged in history. I think it has some really fascinating stuff to it. Again, you're doing very fascinating gameplay. I remember loving as a kid the idea of the agents chasing you, but you can hide in the home and seeing how their AI switches on and off. There's so much fascinating, gameplay elements. But one thing that I really wanted to talk about is it was one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the Atari 2600 games with the most emphasis at the time on the visuals, like the large key illustration of ET on the title screen, and then I always loved the interlocked tree forest backgrounds. It's visually a very ambitious game. Was that something that you kind of wanted to explore even beyond what you'd done on the previous two games?
Absolutely. In order to make Raiders as big as it was, there was a fundamental choice that you face on the 2600. We called it one-line res versus two-line res. You had a choice of doing two-line resolution, which would be like, chunkier graphics, but you needed less attention for graphics, less bits for graphics, and it gave you the opportunity to do more stuff. Or you could go to one-line resolution graphics, which was much more expensive memory-wise, but had a stronger, if you do it well, it has a much stronger visual impact. So with Raiders, the choice to me was clear. I went for the resource savings because I felt the visual presentation of the game would be on more of a macro level as opposed to an individual graphic level, and the gameplay experience needed to be huge. With ET, it's a very different priority. Design priorities in ET were just upside down in a lot of ways. And one of them was I wanted it to be as visually engaging and critical as possible. And to tell you the honest truth, as I've come to think about it in retrospect, that was one of its downfalls, was that the graphics were so good, it created an interesting phenomenon of people actually expecting real life physics in a 2600 video game, which if you think about it is kind of an absurd thing, but it happened. And what I mean by that, everybody knows that, the main issue with ET is the pits. People fall into the pits. They fall in at times where they think they shouldn't. It's problematic. I mean, I made some navigational stuff difficult so there'd be some gameplay in the game. But the idea of you have a block and you have to navigate it between these other blocks, and if you touch them, that's bad. That's a very common mindset in a video game on the 2600, right? But the problem was that I intended to be that way. It was a good looking graphic, but if you touch any part of the graphic on any part of one of the pits, you fall in. One of the big complaints that people had was that, wait a minute, I touched that pit with my head, not with my feet, and I fell in. Well, if you only touch it with your feet to fall in, there isn't much challenge to navigating the game. I wanted there to be more challenging gameplay. But what it really says is that, and Jerome Demurit is the guy who was my longtime friend and my animator and graphics designer on ET and Raiders. And what he had done, he made graphics that were so compelling on the 2600 and sufficiently realistic that people actually bought into them to the point where they expected the game to behave, in real kind of life physics as opposed to just typical video game grammar.
Oh, that's very
And
fascinating.
it is an interesting take on it. In my book, I have many interesting takes on ET. I look at it from all these different angles. What did and didn't cause the crash? What are the issues with ET? What are not the issues with ET? Some people have said the problem I had with ET was that it was actually ahead of its time. Gameplay was a little more sophisticated. I don't know about that.
I think it's
I
very
can tell you,
it's very learnable too, because I know, yeah, people complain about the pits, but I didn't have an issue. Once you kind of learn, oh, okay, you go up out of the pit and then you're out of the pit and then start walking down. Don't walk right back into the pit. But that's like a one-time learning thing. But I think, that's
right.
something we deal with as game developers all the time, is you're, pulling your hair out because you're like watching somebody play. It's like, why can't you just do this one thing right? You're doing it wrong. And for me, but I think that was also, I like that. And again, going back to Raiders and going back to Yars, I didn't have that many games as a kid. So you put dozens, if not hundreds of hours into each game, learning all their nuance. And so for me, I never really struggled with ET, maybe coming out of the pit the first time, but after a while, you're like, oh no, this is what you do. You press up and then you go down and you just learn the mechanics, and it becomes
Right. And
muscle
you
memory.
can learn it. Thank you. Thank you. Because it is a learnable thing. It's just not super
Absolutely.
intuitive in some ways. But, and the big problem with ET was that, like I said, it took 7 months to do Yars Revenge. It took 10 months to do Raiders of the Lost Ark. Nobody had really done games in less than 6 months at Atari. And when it came time to do ET, I was given 5 weeks.
Oh,
So
geez.
ET is a video game that was entirely done and completed in 5 weeks. Technically 5 weeks and another half day. I found out about it on a Tuesday afternoon. So I had that afternoon, and then it was 5 weeks from the next day. And so I will be happy to put it up against any other 5-week 2600 development. But players don't care. Players don't have to care what went into or what the constraints were. Players only care about a play experience. And a lot of people had trouble with it because I can tell you, ET violated what I consider to be the fundamental sin in video games. And the fundamental sin in a video game is to disorient the player. It's okay to frustrate a player. In fact, it's necessary to frustrate a player, in my opinion. But you shouldn't disorient a player. And there are too many times, because I didn't have the time to ruminate and tune and finish, really fine tune the game. There were too many cases where you'd get into a situation where if you're not sufficiently familiar with the mechanics of the game, you literally don't know what happened or where you are, and you become disoriented. And the way I differentiate between frustration and disorientation is that frustration is like you see the cookie jar, but you can't reach it. That's frustration. Disorientation is I step into the kitchen to get a cookie and I find myself in the garage. That's disorientation. And that does happen a lot in ET because I didn't have the time to then smooth it out so stuff like that wouldn't happen. But I'm very proud of what I accomplished in the time that I had. And in terms of dealing with the worst game of all time, I will say this, is that I really don't believe ET is the worst game of all time, not by a long shot. But honestly, I prefer when people do identify it as the worst game of all time, because I also did Yars Revenge, which is frequently cited as one of the best games of all time. So as long as ET is the worst, I have the greatest range of any game designer in history, and I'm very proud of that.
It's an interesting badge of honor. Absolutely not the worst game of all time. Absolutely an above average Atari 2600 game, warts and all. I think it's great. So thank you so much. We're basically out of time, but thank you so much for going through these. This has been a massive delight for me. Like I said, I've been obsessed with your work since I was a little kid. It absolutely is one of the major reasons I got into this profession. Before we let you go, how can people find out more about you? What are you up to, and what's available in terms of books or anything else?
Well, currently I'm a psychotherapist in California, so you can always go to hswarshaw.com if you like and check that out. But I hope people will check out my book, Once Upon Atari, How I Made History by Killing an Industry. It's all over Amazon. It's also an audiobook, and I read the audiobook. So if you've enjoyed hearing me talk to you about this, you will love the audiobook for Once Upon Atari. So check that out on Amazon or Audible. This has been great. There's so much more to say, and it's a shame that we have to stop. But I would be, if it's okay with you, I'd be happy to come back and talk more another time because I'm really enjoying chatting with you about this, Adam.
I would love to do a part two. So yeah, Hoff, let's look down the line in the schedule and
Yeah, for
let's
sure.
try and make that happen. But yeah,
And by the
thank you
way,
so much. Yeah.
one other thing is if anybody wants an autographed copy of my book or my Once Upon Atari DVD series, documentary series, you can go to onceuponatari.com. Onceuponatari.com, you can order autographed merchandise from me, and I do it personally and directly to you.
I will
All right.
absolutely take you up on that, sir.
That is super cool. Yeah, I think that's going to
Thank
do
you
it for
so much.
today. Yeah, thanks so much, Howard, for joining us. Adam, thank you as well. Thank you, everyone who listened and chatted. You can find the link for Howard's book in the YouTube description. Also, just a couple other things I want to mention in case you missed it. A WayForward classic, Sabrina Zapped, was announced today as a repro cart from Mod Retro. You can head over to their website and order that right now. We'll try to discuss that more in a future episode. Additionally, pre-orders for the 2025 Shantae Swimsuit Special Comic Book are live on the Udon Entertainment website and other places fine comic books are sold, so please check that out. For now, though, Adam, Howard, any last things to say before we sign off?
I would just say thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no, this has been something I've been looking forward to a long time. And as soon as we started talking about having guests on the show, you were at the top of our list. So thank you so much for making the
I
time.
can vouch for that.
It's my pleasure. I'm only sorry that I have to run.
Okay, then, that does it. Thank you again, everyone. We will catch you next time.